I guess we can get started here. So, hi everyone, welcome to PSY 275. I always hold my breath just a little bit when I say that because I hope that both you and I are in the right place. But if at least one of you is supposed to be here for this, then I found the right room. So for today, I'm just going to go over sort of the basic day one of a course stuff, introduce myself, talk a little bit about the course, and maybe start just a little bit on chapter 1. Luckily, it's the first week and the first chapter is nice and short, so we'll ease in and probably be done a little bit early this week. So for step 1, I'll start by introducing myself. And I like to preface this with saying that I give a little bit of my background because as a science instructor, my job is to teach you to critically evaluate information. So by being here and telling you sort of my background and what my experience is, I'm explaining why I am credible as a person to tell you about this topic. So that being said, when I get started, my background is a little bit different than you might expect for somebody lecturing about psychology. So I got my bachelor, well, I guess first off, hi, my name is Dr. Kimberly Campbell. You can call me Kimberly, you can call me Dr. Campbell. I always skip over that part because, I don't know, I just never think to mention it. But I got my Bachelor of Science at Dalhousie University. I started out in their physics program, and I realized that numbers were not for me, so I switched to bio. And that's actually where I did my 5-year undergrad degree, was in biology. So I did a lot of ecology stuff. I did research relating to genetics and sequencing genes, which I'll get into in a couple of slides. But that didn't really put me on a path to get into psychology. I actually took some time off. I worked with the federal government in Nova Scotia, helped clean up lighthouse sites for a couple of years, and then I decided, you know what, I like birds, so I would like to study personality in birds, which I didn't quite do, but I did switch over and find a lab where I could study learning and communication in birds, which seemed pretty close to me. So I got my master's and my PhD at the University of Alberta in the Songbird Neuroethology Lab. So I've been working with black-capped chickadees, looking at the vocalizations they produce, and what they might mean, though mean is a very tentative term that a lot of people don't like. I also like to talk a little bit about myself other than as an academic, especially having done about 4 semesters of online learning. It's really easy to come across as just a faceless academic, and I really liked doing this section, so I figured I'd keep it even though we're back in person. So me as a person, I'm clearly a bird lover. I have 2 birds at home. They occasionally make appearances if ever I record something from home. Because if you've ever had birds, you know they don't like to be quiet. I love chocolate. I do photography as a hobby whenever I have time. It's sort of the easier way to do something artistic without having to put a lot of time into it, in my opinion. But if I had the time, I'd do other stuff too. I've played Pokemon since I was very small and continue to do so. And I like to collect hobbies. So if I find that ever elusive time, I like to try things like painting and knitting and sewing and sculpture and all sorts of things. So that's just a little bit about me outside of research. And I actually keep forgetting to move these slides around. Since I was talking about birds, I started including this picture when I was online, and these guys made regular appearances in my audio lectures. You guys won't see them that much because they don't come to class with me, but it's a really fun way to put in pictures of cute birds, so why not? So back a slide to my research background, a little bit more on that credibility side of things. So I mentioned as an undergraduate, I did research in that genetics area. So specifically, I was sequencing DNA samples to identify single-celled organisms that we had collected from soil, which is kind of dull sounding. Basically, we drove out to the beach whenever it would be low tide. We collected some muck from the lowest parts in the beach, and we brought it back to the lab and extracted all the DNA from it. And then I figured out primers that would let us amplify particular genes so we could figure out what we were looking at. So I never thought that that would lead me to doing operant conditioning in songbirds, but that is what I moved on to. So when I talk about learning and communication, I've looked at sort of just the bioacoustics of chickadee songs and calls, sort of what's the structure of what they're saying. But I've also done some hands-on research where we'll do operant conditioning. We'll play them a sound and teach them that sounds like this are good sounds and they'll get you food. And then we'll play them new sounds and see if they treat the new sounds like the ones that they know should get them food, or if they treat them differently. So we can make some assumptions about how they form categories of sounds, which is pretty cool. So whenever possible, if we have time, I like to work in a little sub-lecture on how that works, because it's kind of neat to see some of that stuff in action. But I'll see how much of the research I've worked with we can introduce. And then the last part for my introduction to me is my teaching philosophy. So I always point out the fact that my slides are very dull. They're very plain, simple, white background, black text. And that's intentional. That's because I've had students in my classes before that have trouble with things that are low contrast. And if that has ever been an issue for you, you know that textbook images and the slides that come directly from textbooks are notoriously bad for that. So as much as possible, I try and redo those so that they're higher contrast and then easier to see. So though they are plain, it's with intention. And I like to take that same mindset throughout all of my teaching and learning, because I wouldn't have thought of that unless somebody mentioned it to me. So if you ever think of something that maybe you thought, hey, it would be really cool if you tried this, or I'd like if we talked more about that, definitely let me know. I'm always open for improvement. And then my last point on this slide is for you guys. And this is that you should probably try and make use of the resources that are available to you. I find, especially when I was an undergrad, I was reluctant to reach out. I was reluctant to do more than just come to lecture, read the slides, and write the tests. But as an instructor, I like to include extra things to try and facilitate learning. So I include links on my slides whenever I can, not because I'm testing extra material, but because I think it's something that might be useful for you. I like to share videos on our Moodle site. So I think maybe I explained this topic one way, but I found a Khan Academy video that did a really good job of it explaining it a different way. So I'm going to give you both. And if mine doesn't work for you, maybe theirs does. So check for those things if you have the time, or if you're struggling on a topic, definitely take a look at what else I've posted, because it can be useful. Just don't feel like you have to if you already get it. And then the last thing is ask for help. I try and end my classes just a little bit early, not only to allow you to get to wherever you have to go next, but in case you have questions in class and just want to come up and ask a question. I have my emails, so I'll check those once a day. I can set up Zoom meetings if you wanted to have a sort of face-to-face chat outside of the classroom. We can do all of those things, so don't ever hesitate to get in touch with me. All right, so next is actually the first of what you will find to be many side tangents. This is more of a for your information. This might be useful as opposed to something that you need to know. I include this because as an undergraduate, I had no idea how to interact with other people in science. So if I wanted to talk to my instructor, I didn't know how to do that. So I include this because it's something I wish I had known. And while I'm not super strict on it, there are some people in academia who can get a little persnickety if you don't follow the rules. And I think that's unfair if they don't actually teach you those rules. So that's what this is going to be, just a couple of slides on how to address people in academia. So if you're sending an email or meeting someone in person, how do you decide what title to use? Do you go with instructor or doctor or professor, Mr., Mrs.? Well, how do you pick? So the quick rule of thumb would be that if somebody has a PhD or an MD, you can call them doctor, because that's the title that goes with those degrees. So as I said, you can call me Dr. Campbell because that's my degree. If somebody is a professor, that's going to be someone, almost always a doctor, at least in North America, who has specifically been hired as a professor. So professor is a job title. So you could call a professor, again, in North America, professor or doctor pretty much interchangeably, and that's okay. It would be based on their preference. I know my sister did her degree over in England, and it's a little bit different over there, so check there if you're going to be doing that. For instructor, that's somebody who isn't a professor but is teaching a course. And I actually fall under that category because my job title is not professor. I am an assistant lecturer, so I would be an instructor rather than a professor. And I made a handy visual on that because the words didn't quite work for my brain. So I'm the little purple dot in the middle. I would be an instructor. I also classify as a doctor. But then if you have somebody who is a professor, they're going to pretty much always be a doctor as well. And if you are a professor, you're not also going to be an instructor because you can't have the two conflicting job titles. And for a practical example, I always use my graduate supervisor, Dr. Sturdy. So we can look here, we have Chris Sturdy. We just pulled up his profile page from the university he works at. We can see that he has a master's and a PhD, so we could call him Dr. Sturdy. We'd feel confident in that decision. His job title is also a professor of science, and so we could call him Professor Sturdy and feel pretty confident in that as well. So that's just how I would choose to do that. With that being said, that's sort of a first contact kind of thing. What I usually use as a rule of thumb is if I send someone an email, I look at how they respond to me. So for most people, they'd send me an email and they'd say, "Hey, Dr. Campbell, have a question." And I'll look at how they sign off. And that, in my mind, is how they'd like to be addressed. So I'll start my email and say, "Oh, hello, what you signed off as. Here's my response to your question." And I'll sign off usually with my first name. And that's me saying, Dr. Campbell was fine, but you can also call me my first name. So that's sort of a little shorthand when you're dealing with academics. And most people in general, they will sign off as what they prefer to be addressed as. That does go out the window if they have one of those auto-generated signatures, but that's sort of its own thing. So that's the little tangent there. Maybe you find it useful, maybe you already knew that, but I knew that I didn't figure that out until my first year of my master's, so I always pass that info along. All right, so the last part of our introductory slides is actually getting into this course and what we're going to talk about in this course, and more the format of this course. So this is a second year class. You should probably have some grasp of some of the basic stuff, so we'll try and keep things a little bit lighter than I would for, say, my first year classes. But you should already know about Moodle. Moodle is going to be really important for this course. That's where you're going to find a lot of information that we need for this class. It's where you're going to find info about assessments. It's where you can get the syllabus, where you'll have access to announcements. I post frequently asked questions because I find if more than one student emails me about a topic, it's usually because that topic was either poorly explained or unclear in some way. And if 2 people have asked, that means there's a lot more of you that don't know the answer but haven't really gotten up the courage to ask yet. So in those cases, I'll post on Moodle just to give everyone that information. So especially when it comes to things like assignments, if I find that I want more information to you guys, I'll update the descriptions there. And I try my best to bring attention to that fact in class, but I'm a little bit scatterbrained, so it doesn't always occur to me. That's also where you're going to find lecture recordings and slides. So you might have noticed I have a little bit of a crazy setup up here. And that's because I've been recording my lectures at home for 18 months. And it seemed pretty easy to bring that setup here so that if you can't make it to class or if you don't want to be on campus, you have access to the whole lecture as it is. So what I'm doing is recording my voice separately. I'm recording my screen for you, and I'm going to put that on, actually I put it on YouTube because Moodle doesn't have a large enough file capacity, and then I just give you a link to YouTube. So that way, even if you want to come to class, but you'd like to rewatch or re-listen to the lectures, you can do it that way as well. And I find it really helpful because YouTube gives us subtitles, and it does a pretty good job of matching what I say in class. I do take a quick look. There are certain terms that I know it struggles with, so I try and catch those, but they are fairly helpful. And you can play it faster or slower, which was something I found very useful the last couple of months. So all of that will be posted on our Moodle, usually within a couple hours of a class, but it can take up to a day, just depends on processing. And that's where you can also get the slides. So I'll try and post everything at least the day that we're going to be talking about it in class. If I have stuff ready in advance, I'll post it in advance. So it just depends on how quickly I'm working that week. All right, so speaking of Moodle, I'm actually going to hop over to our course Moodle page. And I always have to give the sort of hand wave that this is what it looks like for an instructor. Yours might be a little bit different in terms of buttons, but the layout should be the same. Oh, yes?
I believe if you click the little down arrow at the top, there should be a view in students view option.
This one. Oh! That's super useful. I have never seen that before. Thank you. Oh, that's so much better. Okay, perfect. Now I know what you guys see, because that has been a problem for longer than I would care to admit. All right, so this is our course. I've put a calendar over in the corner here. You can add your own stuff. I try to remember to go through and add the important dates for this course as well. It just takes a little while. Stuff gets busy at the beginning. I have a link for my email address. So if you wanted to get in touch with me, you can click that and it'll pop up a window. Whenever you send me an email, please try and include the course code in the subject line, because I'm teaching multiple classes and the answer to your question may depend very dramatically on what class you're in. So I do teach similar topics at different levels, and I would hate to give you more or less information than you need. You can access the syllabus here. You can hop into the announcements here. The announcements should also automatically send you an email, so you shouldn't have to manually check the announcements every day. It's just a nice place to see them all collected if you want them, but you should get an email to your course or to your Concordia account whenever anything gets sent out. So if anything happens, I have to move something, I'm giving you advanced warning or reminder of something that's due soon, that'll come through that. I also very recently learned that you can collapse topics on Moodle. So instead of having to scroll for 5 minutes or more by the end of the semester, we can just collapse and expand whatever topics you need at that time. And there aren't any in this section, but I believe this one includes little tick boxes where you can actually check off things as you complete them. So that's just for your own records. I find it nice to have a visual indicator. Oh, I've already downloaded those slides. Or, oh, I've already done that quiz. You can check it off for yourself so you can remember what you've finished. And I include sort of the basic information. This first section is basically a frequently asked questions for the start of course. Just saying that attendance isn't required because I'm recording and I don't take attendance. Should you read the textbook? If you're this kind of person who does well with textbooks, it's a good textbook. If you're not going to read a textbook, then you're not going to read a textbook. I was one of those students who bought all my textbooks and refused to read them, required or not. So I always give that little disclaimer. Class slides will be found on here, actually in each of the week folders. So you can see for this week, we have our day 1 slides, which are what I just finished. And then we also have the chapter 1 slides, which is what I'm going to start today, but what we'll also work on next class as well. And so some of our chapters will span multiple weeks. So say week 2, or chapter 2, I guess, will expand, I think it's week 2 and 3. So I'd only post them the once in week 2. I'm not going to post them again if we're just continuing. But if I have to break it up into, say, chapter 1, part 1, and then chapter 1, part 2, then they might be in different spots. But I try and put them where they are logically expected to be found based on what we're talking about. All right. Close those all back up again. And I'm going to switch over to our syllabus. As I said before, you guys have probably looked at tons of syllabi, especially since it's the first week of classes. So I'm just going to hit the high points for this course. I would recommend, if you haven't read through a syllabus all the way, maybe do it at least once so you can see what other useful information is in here. It includes lots of links and contact info, and it tells you which specific documents to look at if you need more information in case of emergencies. So it's good to know what's there, but I find I just keep a printed copy of my syllabus in my binder, and I reference it all throughout the semester. All right, so emails here again. Office hours are by appointment, and that's because I don't actually have an office. They're in the process of getting more office spaces for those of us who lecture, but I don't technically have a desk. So I will set up Zoom meetings if you want to meet and chat about anything. And as I said, I'm going to end classes early most days, so you can stick around and ask questions, or you can ask questions during class if you want to as well. All right. So this table here is one of the most important documents for this course. I specifically went through and printed out this page of all of my syllabi last night so that I can tape them to my wall. And that's because it lists all of the topics, all of the dates we're covering those topics, what you're being tested on, when things are due, that sort of thing. So this is a fantastic resource to have available. I'd recommend in the first week of any of your classes to sit down, go through the syllabus, and find sort of when are the midterms, when are the tests, when are assignments, all those things, and write them down. I find I live out of a Google Calendar, and this is the best place to start for that. So you'll notice here we have on September 28th, we have midterm 1, and that's going to cover chapters 1, 2, and 3. And then some of these, we don't cover every single chapter in this book, so this is a great place to see what we do and don't cover. So you'll notice that we go from 4 to 5, 5 to 6, 6 to 8, 8 to 11, and then 11 to 14. So make sure you're not reading chapters that you don't have to read, unless you find it interesting, then power to you. But that's going to include our due dates. It's also holidays, so when we have our reading week and stuff like that. All right, so the next section is all of our different evaluations for this class. You probably figured out by now, we have midterms, 2 of them. They're each going to be worth 25%. They're going to be written in this classroom during class time. So first one, September 28th, second one, November 2nd. Those are not cumulative. That means that the first midterm is going to test on the first couple of chapters we cover, 1 to 3. And then the second midterm will cover the next batch of chapters that we cover in class. The only cumulative assignment or exam is going to be the final exam. And what I do for my final exams is I weight it more heavily towards new material, stuff you haven't been tested on yet. And that'll be about 60 to 70% of the final exam. And the remainder will be stuff from earlier chapters. And I try and find a way to relate those earlier chapters to the stuff that we're covering now. So I try and do sort of cross-chapter questions for the final as much as possible, just to show that you're thinking. And so the way that I set up those exams is that they're going to be mostly multiple choice, but with some short answer questions. Yeah, go ahead. So my structure is, I'm just going to double check that I said it here. I try and ask questions that are more based around understanding. So I don't love memorization questions. I don't like testing you on names or dates. I'd much rather that you understand how something works and that you could ask a question about applying a concept to a situation. So we're going to talk about a couple of different perspectives or schools of thought. And so instead of saying, who is the head of this school of thought, I might say that this school of thought, headed by a name, what statement would align with their views? And so that way you'd have to know what it means to be in that school of thought and apply it to different statements. That's definitely a kind of question I like to ask, especially on the first midterm. And because I'm the kind of person, I don't really do well with names or dates. You might actually notice sometimes I'll say numbers out of order. What's on the paper should be correct. But again, I try to do my best with numbers. I'm just very bad at them. And that's why I don't test on them. I will occasionally include that information, just like the name in my example, to give those who do use that information that extra piece. But I try not to make questions hinge on just a name or a date, if that makes sense. And so that's going to be how I structure the midterms and the final, is sort of understanding and application type questions. So don't worry so much about memorizing precise things, but focus on how stuff works. I have a different type of question for memorizing and understanding as well, and that's our chapter quizzes. So our chapter quizzes are less about testing your ability to apply concepts, and they're more sort of showing that you're keeping up with the topics and that everything is kind of making sense as we go. So these chapter quizzes are things that I'm going to release as we go through topics in the semester. So the first chapter quiz is going to come out this week, probably tomorrow or Thursday as we get into the topics properly. Again, if I have it done earlier, I'll post it earlier. But the way that I've set up our chapter quizzes, I release them when we're talking about a topic, and then they're not due until the midterm that tests that topic. So for chapter 1, we're going to start it this week, and you have all the way up until September 28th to finish that quiz. You can log in, you can log out, you can save your answers. As long as you don't submit it, you can keep coming back to it as much as you want to. So it's meant to be open book. It's meant to be, as you work through the questions, as you listen to the lectures, as you do stuff, you can sort of pop in and out. So they're not meant to be time-structured quizzes. They're just, here's some questions. And I'll give a smattering of questions, some memorization stuff, but also some examples of the kind of application questions that I might ask on an exam. So that's going to give you a little bit of a feel of different topics and different ways I can phrase questions. So the chapter quizzes are multi-use. And so our first 3 chapter quizzes, I'll release the first one this week. I'll release chapter 2 next week. I'll release chapter 3 the week that we start chapter 3. And then all of those are due on the same day on the midterm date that will test those chapters. And then we start with the next batch for the next midterm. All right, and then the last thing on our list of assessments is a written assignment. And so the written assignment is left very vague to begin with because I find at the beginning of the semester, you guys have lots going on, and I want you to settle into how the chapter quizzes work, getting ready for the first midterm and stuff like that. So what I do is I introduce the written assignment after that first midterm. So at the very beginning of October, we'll have a class, we'll sit down, we'll talk about it. But what I do know is if I don't tell you guys anything about it, people worry. So I will give you a very Coles Notes version of it with no details. Basically, I get you to read some piece of scientific literature and write a short, maybe 2 or 3 pages, double-spaced analysis of that literature. So read an article, critically evaluate it, and hit a couple of points that we talk about in class. So it's not meant to be a massive assignment. It's not meant to take up a ton of time. It's just for you to show that you can do some critical thinking and that you can access some scientific literature. So hopefully that's enough that you know not to worry too much about it. I'll introduce it at the beginning of October, and then it's not due till the middle of November, so you have lots of time to work on it. All right, so I think that is all of our assessments. Oh, one more thing to mention about emails. I did say that send me an email, include the subject code or the course code in the subject line. When you're sending an email, it's also really helpful if you give me more than a generic statement of I don't understand this topic. Because a lot of the topics that we cover are fairly broad. So if you send me an email that says I don't understand monism. It's like, well, what part? I could write you paragraphs and maybe miss your point entirely. So it's a lot more useful if you write something that says, in class, we talked about monism, I understand this part, this is what we said, I get this, but I don't know how to apply it to this situation. Well, now I know exactly what you need, and I can give you a very helpful answer, and I don't have to write a whole paragraph to get it across, at least theoretically. So if you can give me as much info as you can when you send an email, that makes my responses that much more useful. And so that's what this whole paragraph about emails is saying. All right, and I think the last thing I want to touch on is what happens if you have to miss an assignment or an exam or whatever. So the final exam is its own beast. The university has its own rules on what happens if you miss a final exam. There's an official approval process, and that's discussed in the syllabus. It links you to the official paperwork and that sort of thing. So that's something that you have to let me know, but I'm not sort of the last stand on what happens there. For everything else in the class, everything's going to come to me, and I'm the one who's going to make arrangements. So my policy is if you miss a midterm, I don't do rewrites of midterms. It's really hard to write a second document and find a time that we can all meet to do it, and if there's multiple people who miss it, it causes problems. So what I do is I have the final exam test all the topics for this course, and that means that we'll just assess you on the final exam. So we move the weight of the missed midterm to the final exam. If you have to miss a chapter quiz or the written assignment, if you can't make that due date, that's a little bit different. So for those, if you can let me know in advance what's going on, I'll usually be able to find some kind of arrangement for you. Maybe you need an extra 24 hours. Maybe we need to find another way to do it, something like that. But just give me as much warning as you can. The official on paper is that you have to let me know within 24 hours if anything has gone wrong. There are situations where maybe you can't contact me in 24 hours because of real reasons. I'll always take that into account. But I like to explain that if you give me a lot of warning, if you can tell me in advance what's going on, I can help avoid some of the stress and we'll find an alternative. All right, and I think that was everything I needed to hit in the syllabus. Before I move on to chapter slides, is there any questions, anything you wanted more info on? Not yet? Okay. Just going to pause for 1 second. Oh, yeah.
I'm just wondering about the time that you would actually post the YouTube videos for the online part.
So I try and do it when I get home. So it depends on sort of what I'm doing that day. So usually I'll sit down in the afternoon or evening and I'll upload them. The upload time is not the problem. It's actually the processing time. Because I've seen YouTube videos take like 5 minutes and I've sat around for like 18 hours waiting for it to process. So yeah, sometime between a couple of hours and the next day, but for sure by the next day. Yeah, no problem. And especially for stuff that's coming up, say before an exam, I'll try and have that up like as soon as possible. And I'm just gonna double check because I don't actually remember when this class ends. And I don't want to keep you guys for too long. 40, okay. Yep.
Do your exams include other material in your textbook, or is it mostly during your lectures?
So the way that I describe it is that I use the textbook and I pick what I think is important to teach about. I also use the textbook and pick what I think is important to test about. And there tends to be a lot of overlap between those concepts because I'm choosing what I think is the most central to this topic. There are occasionally things that we didn't cover in a lot of detail in lecture that can be relevant to questions, but it's very rare for you to see a question on something that we didn't even mention in class. So hopefully that helps a little, yeah? Okay. right. So we're going to move on and start talking about actual lecture content. So this is going to be chapter 1, and we're going to start talking about what is behavioral neuroscience. So I find, as always with psychology classes, the first chapter is a little bit of, consider how broad this field is. Let's look at some of the history. Let's talk about the important key figures. And then we'll give you some terms that you need to remember from maybe other classes or previous experiences and that sort of thing. And we're going to follow that exact timeline through this class. And as I said, because it's the first day and the first week, we'll probably wrap up a little bit early, just because we only have like 20 slides and we have 2 whole classes to cover them. So rather than have me talk ad nauseum, I'd rather give you guys the break. All right, so on that note, we're going to start with a very brief introduction. And I find it interesting because our textbook goes on and on about how the human brain can be considered like a cell phone, with all of the different neurons similar to all of the connections on the circuit boards, and the capacity for video, and the fact that if your brain was a video recorder, we'd have over 300 hours of video that you could watch. And they kind of stretch that analogy a little bit too far for my liking, but they do give us some really cool facts as they have that long conversation. So if we think about our human brain, it has evolved and grown quite a bit and is about 3 pounds of sort of neurons and fat and water in our heads. In terms of evolution, we can find pieces of our brain that are similar to distant relatives. Sometimes in anatomy textbooks, they'll talk about the reptile part of our brains, the more basal structures at the bottom of our spinal cord. And we have sort of the more human-specific stuff, some of our frontal lobes that are a lot more developed in humans, and the things that allow us to do all the complex stuff that makes us uniquely human. So there's a lot that's gone on throughout the course of evolution to make our brains the way they are. And of course, as a brain and behavior class, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the brain. So this is just meant to be prepare for all of the cool stuff we're going to talk about. They also gave us that listing of facts where we have 80 billion neurons, and those neurons make up to 100 trillion connections. That is just massive. Those numbers are too large to imagine. And still, all of that is compacted into that 3 pounds of tissue, which is really cool. And our brain is involved in most of the stuff that's going on in our body. So our brain helps me be aware of where I am in my environment, that I'm standing upright, that I'm moving, that I'm talking. So it's involved in all these different processes. And it's even involved in stuff that we aren't consciously aware of. It's allowing us to breathe. It's allowing us to digest food. And it's going to be involved sort of at different levels. And we're going to get into tons of that stuff as we go through this class. But it's kind of interesting to think about. So the 1990s, which fairly recent, was deemed the decade of the brain. And this was sort of when, again, the textbook talking about our equivalence with cell phones. Cell phones were becoming more and more popular. And they also said, hey, it so happens that this was also the decade of the brain. Nice subtle transition. But it was a period where people started paying more attention to the brain and trying to understand how the brain works. So we saw more intensive research, but almost more importantly, we saw an increase in awareness. A lot of scientists were trying to make the public aware of what was going on with brain research. And so that's when people started getting more interested in, well, how does our brain work? What is going on? How do we think things? How are these connections producing thoughts and movements and actions? What's going on? So it was a really neat period to get people interested and to start people wanting to become neuroscientists. And so that's kind of led to this more increased motion that's even going on today, where more and more people are learning about the brain, are studying the brain, and it's leading to us finding a lot more stuff about the brain. And not just brains in humans, there's lots of research looking at brains of other creatures as well. In the lab that I've done work in, where I study how songbirds produce songs and how they learn and how they make decisions, there are other people who have done research on what's going on in their brains while they do this. What parts of their brains react to different sounds? And how does that change based on changing environmental factors? So there's lots and lots of research, lots of different ways to come at this. And it all kind of started, at least in the more broad push, in those 1990s. So this has led to us having a lot more understanding, specifically of neurological diseases. We're starting to learn where some of those might be coming from, how they progress, and how we might be able to prevent them. We're learning more about emotional disorders, so what's happening when our emotions aren't regulating properly, and even addiction and how our brains are changing and reacting when someone has an addiction. So again, the broadness of what we can cover in this field, and all of this came from an analogy to a cell phone, which is strange and interesting. All right, so now that we have our this is going to be really cool and we've got all these different areas we can talk about out of the way, let's talk about what behavioral neuroscience is. And I found this a little bit interesting because I've been doing this long enough that when I was an undergraduate, we didn't necessarily call it behavioral neuroscience. It was biopsychology or physiological psychology or physiological biology or something like that. There's lots of weird combinations that you get. So if you see classes or textbooks that don't call it behavioral neuroscience, maybe they call it some kind of biology and psychology mixture, they're usually talking about the same field. And I find that as a little bit of a tangent to be kind of annoying in psychology, because psychology is a fairly recent field and there's not a lot of agreement on what we call things. So you'll find a lot of similarities. Say North America will have one particular view, but if you go to Europe, they'll have a different view. If you go anywhere, they'll have different ways of terming things. So just be aware that sometimes when you're doing, say, a literature search, the keywords that you think are keywords may not get you everything you need. And that's my little tangent on that. So if we want to talk about what we're going to define behavioral neuroscience as, we're going to say that it studies the relationship between behavior and the body. And specifically, not just the whole body, we're going to focus mainly on the brain. So how is our brain connected to what our body is doing? And so we can have like very broad definitions of behavior, but I find it important to specify that behavior includes both overt and covert events. So overt events are the external things. So standing, talking, breathing, moving, those are all behaviors that you can observe and record fairly easily. Those are overt. But the internal covert events are things that you can't necessarily observe. That's why they're called covert, because they're sort of hidden. Things like thoughts and emotions, what's going on in your head, what you've learned but haven't demonstrated yet. Those are all things that are really hard as a researcher to try and quantify and measure. So even though it isn't something that we can necessarily have appear on a video camera, we can't check a box when it happens, it is something that's still happening, and it is something that we're going to call a behavior. So it's always good to note that that definition of behavior might be a little bit more broad than what you traditionally think of. All right, so our next topic is the mind-brain problem. Now, if you've done psychology classes before, you might actually know this as the mind-body problem. This is another little quirk from our textbook, where we have the mind-body problem, this concept of how does our mind, something that seems intangible and unknowable, how does it relate to our physical body? What is the connection between how we think and what we're actually doing. And so you might recall talking about dualists, specifically Descartes, and the idea that the mind and the body are separate. And from intro psychology, you might have had the discussion that the mind and the body being separate is a little bit problematic when psychology is the study of behavior and the mind. So if we're talking about the body being something physical and tangible and measurable, but the mind being something abstract and immaterial and therefore untestable, psychology can't really exist, because if you determine the mind to be something you can't study, something you can't measure, something you can't see, then you can't learn about it, and the whole field kind of falls apart. So that's our issue with dualism, and that's actually that mind-brain problem, or mind-body problem for most people. Our textbook talks about it specifically as the mind-brain problem because it's a brain and behavior class, because we're specifically caring about the brain and how it's influencing our body. So we're just looking at a more zoomed-in version of the mind-body problem, and we're calling it the mind-brain problem. So that's why the strange title. So if I've said that dualism is sort of problematic because how do you study something that you have defined as unstudyable, that means that dualism doesn't really work with what we want to look at. And that's where monism comes in. So you'll usually see these principles presented as sort of two sides of a coin. So dualism is you can't study the mind because it's abstract and unknowable, but monism is the idea that the mind and the body are made up of the same substance. So the mind isn't something separate and unknowable, it's actually just the same thing as the body. And there's different kinds of monism. In your intro psych textbook, they'll call it monism and dualism and call it a day. But our textbook for this course goes into the idea of materialistic monism and idealistic monism. And idealistic monism is the idea that everything is sort of immaterial and untestable and unknowable. But that isn't very practical for us at all. So we go with a more materialistic monism view, which is the view that the body and the mind and everything else that we're looking at is physical. And this is kind of a weird concept to wrap your head around, because we think of our minds as, again, abstract, something sort of untangible. But the textbook does a great job talking about how we should frame this to consider it instead. And that's the idea that, let's think for a moment about weather. You can talk about the weather, you can discuss, it's cloudy today, there is weather. But weather itself isn't something tangible or definable. It's a way that we describe the conditions of outside. So weather itself isn't a thing, it's just a description of something that's happening. So maybe our mind isn't itself a standalone thing, but it's how we've organized all the stuff that's going on in our brains as we're doing things throughout the day. So we don't necessarily have a mind as a single entity. Maybe it's describing what's going on, the connections in our brain, the firing of neurons, our perception of the environment. That's all sort of side effects, and we call it our mind to talk about it. As with some topics in psychology, this can be a fairly contentious subject, and it might not necessarily be your own personal view, but it does make it a lot easier when we start thinking about studying the mind. In practicality, sometimes you'll see people who say, well, maybe it doesn't matter what the mind is. We're only looking at what the brain is doing and what we're perceiving and how that all works. So the mind is irrelevant, and that's okay. So we're going to fall somewhere in between that spectrum for this class, where, yeah, maybe you can relate to and agree with this materialistic monism point of view, or maybe we can just accept to not be able to know what's going on with the mind and be okay with that. So it's one of those topics where maybe we agree to disagree. I honestly don't know what my perspective would be, and I don't think I will ever know enough to be able to make that decision. All right. Oh, okay, I'm just trying to remember what I wanted to say for this slide. So this is René Descartes. So this is that person I mentioned when we were talking about our dualism, the idea of the mind and the body being separate. So it's kind of a neat transition to go from, okay, so he was the one who was really strongly behind that idea of the mind and the body being separate, but he also helps us illustrate a really good point that we want to discuss next, so we can transition between those two ideas. So Descartes had this idea that the mind was that separate entity, it was unknowable, but he wanted to figure out how the mind might be interacting with our body to have the body do things. And at the time, this was, I believe, in the 1500s, so this was quite a while ago. Actually, no, it is 1500s to the 1600s. I didn't think I'd remember that one. But at the time, they had no way to really know what was going on in the body. They couldn't take pictures in an MRI, they couldn't figure out how things were moving, so there was a lot of guesswork. And in fact, that's what we're going to talk about is models. So using something else to stand in for what you're trying to understand. So Descartes figured that the brain or the mind was going to be interacting somewhere in the brain to produce the movements that we see as people interact with their world. And he viewed a series of statues in the area that he lived. And with these statues, people would stand on different plates, and it would push water down and cause the statues to move. So there's a hydraulic system where applying pressure in one place led to movement in the other place. And he thought, well, that must be how we're moving. So our minds are exerting pressure in our brains and leading to movement of our arm. So if I think thoughts that lead to arm raising, there must be some kind of fluid or something moving that pressure to lead to that motion. And so his perspective was that the place that this was happening, this interaction between sort of the mind's control and the body doing things, was our pineal gland. And his rationale for this was a little bit interesting. It is one of very few structures in the brain that they had identified at the time that didn't exist as two mirrored pieces. So the pineal gland is located centrally. It looks kind of like a pine cone. And so there's only one of them. It is symmetrical, but there isn't one on one side and one on the other. It is a single unit. And from the shape of it and the fact that it was a flexible structure, he argued that while it's centrally located, it's in the exact spot we would expect a control center to be, and this gland can bend from left to right to direct that fluid that must be controlling our movements. And this is where it gets even better. His proposed fluid was what he called animal spirits, things that would move through the body and cause these motions. And so this theory, if you read about it, it's a really interesting, very well thought out theory that was absolutely nowhere near right. But it did give us a sort of a first model, a way of interpreting what might be happening. And that does bring us to talking about models and the way of thinking that came out of that. So I kind of already mentioned this, but a model is a proposed mechanism for how something works, which is a pretty broad way to say it. And that's because models can come in lots of different forms. So a model could be a theory. So Darwin's theory of evolution, he didn't necessarily have a concrete instance that he could point at, like, this is exactly evolution happening, but he could have a theory pulling in some evidence that showed how it might happen. So that theory was a model for what might be occurring. A model could also be something like a model species, a simpler organism. Maybe we talk, or often you'll hear people talk about lab rats or lab mice, where you have a smaller organism that you can study how something works on a smaller scale. You can have a simulation. That's been a lot more common lately. As computers get more and more complicated, we can start simulating what might happen in the real world. When I was first doing ecology work, we used to use R to run simulated population genetics. So you'd tell it that the population had this many individuals with this particular gene and that many individuals with that particular gene. How would this go over time? How would evolution happen in this theoretical population over time? Simulations can get a lot more complicated now because you can introduce things like selection pressure and changes in environment and having different genes being more or less beneficial. And it gets very, very detailed and pretty cool too. So there can be models that way. Or you can look at models as a whole system. So instead of just a single organism or a virtual system, you can look at a whole system. So maybe you want to study the ocean, but all you have access to is a tide pool. So maybe you make some extrapolations from that simpler system to make some assumptions about the larger system as a whole. That's how modeling works. It's basically using what you have available to you in order to try and make some educated guesses about the bigger picture. For my own research, bring it back to the songbirds again, we study how chickadees learn and communicate with their songs and calls, and that's actually a model to how humans learn and communicate. And that's because chickadees learn their songs and calls during a sensitive window, just like humans do. They have particular parts of their brain that activate when they hear things that line up with what they expect to hear, just like humans do. And then they start imitating their parents or their tutors, just like babies will imitate their parents. So it's kind of nice to have a model that we can test in a lab that allows us to draw some parallels to something that we couldn't necessarily study. So that's how models can be really useful. And having Descartes' model of that hydraulic movement to explain how our bodies are moving was a good first step in starting to think about things scientifically, and specifically psychological-like things scientifically. And this started to lead to a time where empiricism and more scientific thinking was a lot more common. So when we talk about empiricism, we talk about gathering information through observation, and not just casual observation. So I could decide that I don't know anything about chickadees on this side of the city, so I want to walk around on campus and I'm going to take pictures of chickadees anytime I see them. That's pretty casual observation. But if I start introducing a more systemic, guided procedure to that, maybe I say that every day that I'm on campus, I'm going to walk from this building to the furthest building on campus. I'm going to follow the same path every day. I'm going to go at the same time every day, and I'll take pictures of every bird that I pass every time I walk that. And I'm going to do that every day for a month. Well, that's all of a sudden a little bit more scientific sounding. And that's something that maybe somebody else, if they wanted to reproduce my results, if they wanted to see if they saw the same birds, they could do the same thing, walk the same path at the same time over the same period, and they'd get pretty close. So that's how we start getting into this sort of empirical, scientific way of thinking. We start gathering information by observing our world, and we do it in as systemic as a way as possible. And when we think about applying that to actual science, that becomes really important, because not only does it mean that your science is good, that you've conducted a good experiment, that you've collected data in a good way, but now if anyone ever wants to try and replicate your information, they can do so. You've got a set of rules, a description of how things were done, so that somebody else could try it themselves. And we should talk a little bit more about that later, about replication and the importance of being able to find the same results multiple times. which doesn't necessarily happen. But it's also really neat when you start doing it across different places or between different models. So maybe we found something by doing a specific empirical process with chickadees, but now somebody wants to look at a different songbird. So maybe they have sparrows, and they're going to follow our exact same protocol, but they're going to do it with sparrows. And if they find the same results, if they can replicate what we found in chickadees and sparrows, then maybe that's something that's common not just to chickadees and sparrows, but maybe to all songbirds. And that'd be a kind of cool way to start making connections. So we can use these models to start making educated connections to other things, and it helps with our whole scientific thinking process. All right. The next couple of slides start getting kind of interrelated, and I don't necessarily want to start them and stop them halfway through, so I think we'll call it here for today, and we'll finish the last 10 slides next time on Tuesday. Thursday, yes. Days of the week. Oh dear.